both breeder and hatcheries, and from the extension component. So we worked a lot with the industry, directly with the industry. In his latter years, probably focused more with embryology and incubation. Published a lot of really good information, given talks a lot of different places, very well known in wherever he's been. He's now has a does some private consulting. He's retired from the university and enjoying the life, right, Mike? As a retired person, so, but still doing what he likes to do with incubation. His topic today is going to talk to us about turning and the importance of turning, and we've had a lot of questions from people about the cause and effect of not turning and what can happen, and so he's going to go over some really good information with that. A little bit of housekeeping here. Down on the bottom of your screen, you'll notice a Q&A box, and that's where you put in your question and answer. At any time during the presentation, you can write your question out, type it in that box. At the conclusion of the webinar today, then we'll go through and get to as many of the questions as we can. So it'll be summarized by topic if there's a lot of the similar questions. So I'll ask Mike the questions, summarize as you type them in. You can type them now, type them at the end, however you want to do. And then we'll try and get everything covered as best we can. And with that, I think we've got most people, not most everybody on here, there'll be more, but again, glad to have you here, and we'll let Dr. Wineland go ahead and share a screen and take over, and I will stay present, but take my face off of here so you can look at him. Mike, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Okay, how's that? You seeing it okay?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, I'm just gonna try and move this down there. Okay, thank you very much for letting me talk to you. I was asked to talk about the concepts of turning. And so that's what I'll talk about for the next 45 minutes or so. What I try to do in my presentations is to really stress the why of what you see is going on in a hatchery, so that you can make decisions in your management processes based on science. We can go back to turning. Back when I was in college, which was a long time ago, I was always told that if you had a malfunction in turning, that the embryo was going to adhere to the shell membranes and then would have difficulty hatching. But it's really much, much more than that. Okay, as far as I see it, turning has two functions. Turning impacts the physical development of certain extra-embryonic components that are necessary for proper development of the embryo and resulting in a good chick quality. And then turning also impacts the temperature that the embryo is developing at because of its influence on airflow across the egg mass. Okay, turning encourages three extra-embryonic components that I would say. They are the growth of the area vasculosa, or most people would know it as the yolk sac membrane. It's the vascular system around the yolk. There's also an effect upon the development of what we call the sub-embryonic fluid, and we'll be talking more about that in a little bit. And also, it influences the growth of the CAM, or the chorioallantoic membrane, which is the primary respiratory surface for the developing embryo. Just sort of here's a diagram. Here's the yolk sac, a membrane developing over the surface of the yolk. This is the atlantois, which comes off of the hind gut of the embryo, and the chorion actually comes off the head fold, and it ends up lining the inner shell membrane of the egg. And where the chorion and the atlantois touch, it becomes very, very vascular, and that's going to be the respiratory surface then for that developing embryo. Turning, as I said, it encourages growth of the area vasculosa. And this is, you can see this is a 3-day-old embryo. You can see the blood vessels starting to grow out over the surface of the yolk. And in time, it's going to completely encase the yolk, usually by about day 12. and the yolk membrane that was originally there won't even be in existence anymore. What's the purpose of that yolk sac? Yeah, well, it's there to absorb nutrients for utilization by the embryo. There's specialized cells there in the yolk sac tissue. And then there's also some cells that are going to help transport water and certain ions from the albumin into the yolk, and that's going to be forming then what we call the sub-embryonic fluid. This here is a picture of a frozen egg. It was a 6-day-old embryonated egg. We froze it and then peeled away the shell and the yolk sac membranes. And what I wanted to point out here is that when incubation starts, you know, you have the yolk in the middle of the egg, or mostly in the middle of the egg. The albumin, which is very high concentration of water, surrounds it. Well, you're going to have water start to move across that yolk membrane and into the yolk. And that's what's going to help to form that sub-embryonic fluid. When that occurs, there's differences then now because of that water movement in the specific gravity of the yolk, which is going to cause the yolk to float up near the top of the egg. And the albumin, its change in specific gravity is going to cause it to sink to the bottom of the egg. And so that's what you see here. Here you can see the albumin in the bottom of the egg. What I'm going to outline right now, all of this area here is within the yolk membrane, or the yolk sac membrane. And you can see two distinct layers. This is the lipid portion of the yolk that you see right here. This is a more watery portion of the yolk because of the water influx into the yolk itself to form that sub-embryonic fluid. And the embryo was actually sitting up here at the top inside the amnion that had formed. Okay. And sometimes, I'll just point this out now, sometimes this looks like if you're feeding a corn soy type diet where there's a lot of carotenoids and the yolk is nice and yellow, the sub-embryonic fluid is going to make this portion of the yolk contents look more of a, what I always call a milky yellow, a lighter yellow. Okay, this is the chorioallantoic membrane. It's completely formed by day 12 of incubation. It has to go completely down to the bottom of the egg. And failure to turn after day 12 has been shown not to have any real effect upon further formation of the cam. Okay, what is the function of that chorioallantoic membrane? It acts as the primary respiratory surface, as I said earlier. It's going to take oxygen that diffuses through the pores of the shell. It's going to be picked up by that vessels of the chorioallantoic membrane and carried the oxygen to the embryo. And in reverse, the CO2 that's being produced by the embryo is then going to be carried to the inner surface of the shell of where the chorioallantoic membrane is, and then the CO2 will diffuse out through the pores. It also has a function of taking some minerals from the inner surface of the shell and carrying them to the embryo for what minerals that the embryo needs during development. Here happens to be a chorioallantoic membrane that didn't form completely. This was in came from an egg that wasn't turned at all during the first 18 days of incubation. And you can see that it didn't form all the way down to the bottom. And as a result, now you have a reduced respiration surface. So it's not going to have the ability anyways to get quite as much oxygen as it ordinarily might if there had been a completely formed cam. With turning failures, obviously you're going to see reduced hatch. The chicks are going to hatch later, and you're going to see much poorer quality chicks when you have turning failures, especially if they occur at certain times of incubation. Here's some data from a trial that a student of mine had run, Heather, and she had 7 different groups of eggs, 6 groups of eggs, I'm sorry. And she had one group where she turned them for 18 days, and you can see she had 93% hatch of fertile. She had a second group that weren't turned at all during the 18 days of incubation, and the depression in hatch was down to around 70%. Then she had 2 other groups. One that wasn't turned from day 1 to day 3, but from day 4 to day 18 was turned. And you can see that there was a reduction in hatch down to about 85%. 4th group she had didn't turn for the first 7 days of incubation, but then from day 8 to 18 was turned. And you can also see that there was a reduction in hatch here of 80%. The 2 groups that remained is where she turned them for 1 to 3 days, and then from day 4 to day 18 didn't turn. You can see that wasn't hurt that bad. It wasn't really significantly different from the group that had been turned for a full 18 days. And the same thing was true for the group that was turned for the first 7 days, and then not turned from day 8 to 18. So that first week of incubation is what really seems to be important. She also noted in her trials that by not turning, you would see an increased amount of residual albumin in late stage embryos that didn't hatch. And by that, I mean by anything older than 18 days, because really that albumin that was in the bottom of the egg should have been totally utilized by the embryo by the 18th day of incubation. And then there was also an increase in early and late embryonic mortality that she noted, as well as you can see that the difference in the amount of sub-embryonic fluid that was formed. In those that were turned, it was 28.5 mils versus 26 mils for those that weren't turned. And there is some evidence that the amount of sub-embryonic fluid that's formed during incubation can impact viability of the embryos. Okay, a little bit about the albumin transport to the amnion. I told you earlier that the albumin sinks to the bottom because of the change in specific gravity when water moved from the albumin into the yolk. Well, then from about day 4 to about day 12, there's going to be a connection, and it's called the seroamniotic connection, that's going to develop. And it's going to link the albumin sac in the bottom of the egg to the amnion, which is the membrane that surrounds the embryo. Okay, and from it's starting around day 12, then that albumin in the bottom is going to be transported up to the amnion, where the embryo is going to swallow the albumin and thus receive nutrients from the albumin. If there's albumin that's not transported up to the amnion, obviously then that embryo is going to be of poor quality because it didn't necessarily receive all of the nutrients that it should have received. Another thing to point out is if chicks hatch from the eggs that aren't turned, and that happens, and there's albumin left in the bottom of the egg when they do hatch, those are going to be the chicks that appear to have matted down and what we sometimes call sticky chicks. I'd like to talk now a little bit about turning angle. This is some real old work out of the University of Missouri, where they looked at different turning angles. Here's 45 in the center. That's, of course, what we try to achieve. They turned 30 degrees, and they turned 60, and they also turned 75 from vertical. And in order to achieve this, obviously, they had to wire the eggs in to get them to turn that much. But as you can see here, And by this bar right here, you can see that the best hatch came when eggs were turned 45 degrees. Okay. Then I want to talk a little bit about another trial that Heather had run. And in this trial, she had turned eggs at either 15 degrees from vertical, 30 degrees from vertical, or 45 degrees from vertical. And she did it just one time per hour. Okay. And as you would expect, what she found was that she had about 91% hatch of fertile, where they were turned 45 degrees. When they were turned only 15 degrees, you can see it was 58% hatch of fertile. And if they were turned 30, it was in between the two, and it was up to 83% hatch of fertile. So basically what it comes down, and other things she found were that if turning was only 15 degrees, and actually I've gone into hatcheries and just checked turning on some when I do audits, and I see them 20, 25 degrees when people don't really are not thinking about it. But anyways, with only turning 15 degrees from vertical, she saw an increase in malpositions, especially with head over the left wing or head in the small end of the egg. She had seen an increase in embryonic mortality. She saw an increased incidence of pipped chicks, and she saw an increased incidence of, as I said earlier, residual albumin, and also hemorrhaging of that chorioallantoic membrane. Turning only 15 degrees also resulted in less subembryonic fluid being formed. As we already said, there was a decrease in hatch of fertile, but she also saw that the chicks were smaller, but that they had a larger amount of residual yolk when compared to the controls of 45 degrees. Turning only 30 degrees, it wasn't quite as harmful as turning 15, as you saw in the one slide, but it still wasn't as beneficial as 45 degrees from vertical. She looked at in another trial, a couple different turning angles of 15 and 45, where she turned the eggs just once per hour. And then she had a third treatment where she turned 15 degrees, but she turned it for 3 times per hour. And what she found was, here you can see 45 one time per hour and 91% hatch of fertile. If she turned 15 one, you had that decrease of 44, but you can see that by turning 3 times per hour at 15, there was a 20% increase in hatch of fertile, just by increasing the frequency of turn. And you can also see that the size of the chick was different. Here this is chick without the residual yolk sac involved, and this you can see it was 38.58 grams versus 36.67 for the 15 one time per hour. But the size of the chick did increase if she increased the frequency of turning at that low turning angle. Also notice that the size of the heart in those turned only 15 degrees one time per hour was smaller compared to turning 45 degrees. The 15 3 times per hour, it was intermediate between, but it wasn't really different from the 45. Okay. And then subembryonic fluid, as we've already talked about. Okay, she looked at what was the differences in embryonic mortality at the different turnings. Here you can see her embryonic mortality for days 1 to 3, 4 to 10, 11 to 16, 17 to 21, and then pips. You can see here when they were turned at 45 one times per hour, pretty reasonable. And then when they were turned 15 degrees one times per hour, you can see that there was a significant increase in every case except for 11 to 16 for that angle and frequency. When she increased the frequency to 3 times per hour to 15, then there was some improvement from when it was just 1 time per hour. Here you can see some malpositions that she noted. This is 45 1 time per hour, and this is 15 then 1 time per hour. You can see head over left wings increased significantly. Under the left wing, malposition had increased significantly. Over right wing increased significantly. Small end embryos in the small end increased significantly. The only one that wasn't significantly different was really the head between the legs as a malposition. And then the 3 times per hour at 15 degrees was intermediate between the two. Okay, she also looked at some other symptoms that she would see in the eggs and in the chicks that hatched. And she looked here at the amount of residual albumin. What was the frequency of residual albumin? And you can see here it was 1.76% in the 45, but had increased tremendously to 24% when they returned only at 15 for one time per hour. And this all goes back to some problem with the connection between the albumin sac in the bottom and the amnion, with that seroamnionic connection to be able to transport the albumin that was in the bottom of the egg up to the amnion where the embryo could swallow it. The incidence of exposed intestines was noted to be different. You can see here a significant increase at 15 1 times per hour compared to the 45 degrees. Increased incidence of hemorrhaging of the chorioallantoic membrane was noted also, and also the incidence of excessive urates. In other words, there's the nitrogenous waste from the embryonic kidney had increased significantly. Okay, and then of course, sort of in between was where she increased the frequency for 3 times per hour over the 1 time per hour for that 15 degrees from vertical. Okay, so what she came out of it was turning eggs 3 times per hour compared to 1 time per hour still wasn't the angle of choice because it didn't improve the amount of sub-embryonic fluid. She said it did not decrease the incidence of embryonic mortality, especially between days 1 to 3 and 4 to 10 or at PIP. And it did not really decrease the incidence of certain malpositions enough. So what one could say is, what happens when your eggs aren't capable of being turned 40 to 45 degrees because maybe the eggs are large, maybe it's some mechanical problem with your machine. Then that's a case maybe where increasing the frequency of turning might be of some advantage. The big thing you have to worry about would be is what is it doing to the integrity of your turning devices? Is it going to create more wear and tear on your turning device? This is a trial that Okan Elabo, he's over in Turkey, performed a number of years ago. He used the same angles, I believe it was 45 degrees. He turned 24 times per day, 48 times per day, or 96 times per day. And you can note that when he looked at hatch-a-fertile, it was significantly increased, but it was a little bit better than 1% increase. And the incidence of late deads were less compared when he turned 96 times versus 24 times. But again, I have to say is, what is it doing to the equipment? Is it producing more wear and tear than is really needed? This trial here, from this person, what they had looked at was how fast should the eggs be turning? Okay, rapid turning, 1 time per hour, is the typical turning that we observe in our incubators now, where they go from one 45 degrees from vertical to the other 45 degree from vertical in a relatively short period of time. This continuous slow turning meant that it took the entire hour to complete the turn of 90 degrees from one side to the other. And you can notice there was a numerical difference with continuous, but it wasn't significantly different. The only thing he did note was a reduction in percent early deads, but then he had an increase in late deads. So you can take it for what you want. Okay, turning also is going to impact the temperature that embryos are developing at. And that's because temperature governs the rate of development. If I have elevated temperatures, my embryo is going to grow faster. If I have suboptimal temperatures, they're going to grow slower. And as far as I'm concerned, the size of the embryo when it enters that plateau stage of oxygen consumption is important. If you grow a large embryo early on, you're going to see an embryo going into what we call that plateau stage of oxygen consumption earlier, and it's going to be in a slightly hypoxic state for a longer period of time. So turning, as I said, it manages airflow across the egg in order to provide heat to the newer developing embryos, especially in our multi-stage embryos, by removing metabolic heat from our older embryos. And the other point we got to keep in mind is air is always going to seek the path of least resistance. And so we want to make sure that our door seals are good. Any grout you may have under your machines is there, so that air is going to go where it's intended to go. And in fact, in the point of the Jamesway multi-stage machine, you want to make sure that your curtains are hung properly in order to promote the movement of air where it's designed to go. Okay, turning inadequacies created by the airflow can cause embryos, as I said, to develop at elevated temperatures, which is going to end up showing embryos and chicks demonstrating some of the effects and some of the symptoms that we typically would associate with elevated temperatures. I can remember years ago reading a book entitled The Art of Incubation, and in it they had a problem-solving chart and things like that. And it always seemed to be that for many of the symptoms, if it was a temperature problem, it also could have shown up as a turning problem. More than likely, it's because the turning influences airflow over the eggs. Okay, airflow is different between all the machines that we basically have out there. I mean, Chickmaster multi-stage is quite a bit different from the Jamesway multi-stage, which is different from the Peterstein multi-stage. And as a result, the orientation of the egg flats, the airflow is quite different. So it's all of them. We got to keep that in mind when we're looking at a particular machine. Okay, I thought I would add a little bit on egg orientation during incubation, since turning is really orientation also. And what I wanted to talk about here was a trial that Henry Wilson, when he was at the University of Florida, did. And he had a group of eggs that he set large end up or small end up, okay? And he looked just at what was the mortality before transfer and what was the mortality after transfer. And you can see the mortality before transfer wasn't really much different. But the mortality that occurred after transfer, because they were set small end up, had increased fourfold here, as you can see here. And of course, resulted in a reduced hatch of fertile. Another thing to keep in mind with orientation of the eggs is not all embryos that are in eggs upside down will malposition. Some will still go to the large, position themselves to the large end of the egg. But a good number obviously will malposition to the small end. And when an embryo malpositions to the small end of the egg, there's going to be less oxygen available to the embryo because there's no air cell down there, okay? And I always feel then they're going to be in that slightly hypoxic state for a longer period of time, and it's going to be stressful on hatching and that. You're also going to see problems with the chicks from those eggs hatching slightly sooner than they would if they were positioned correctly in the egg. And you're also going to see some problems with navel healing. This is just showing some embryo weights, and this happens to be, this is from Ken Takeshita. I can never say his name very well. He was a vet out in California when I first met him. But you can see here, this is small end up. This is the weight of the embryo, and this here is small end down. You can see it was better embryo weight at 9 days of age. Looking at percent mortality. This is small end up. You can see drastic increase in mortality in his first trial compared to where the small end is down. His second trial showed the same, as well as his third trial showing similar results. So increased embryonic mortality, as most hatchery people already know, is happening. Okay. Well, what I find interesting with this is the time from the time that the embryo pips the shell to when it hatches. And what he found out that if the eggs were set with the small end up, so upside down, you can see that on average it was taking about 20 hours for the embryo to complete the hatching process. Remember, these also started to hatch a little sooner. If it was small end down, it was down to around 11 hours, as you can see here. And then you can see the difference in hatch percentage right here. Okay, this is a graph from his from Ken's work where he was looking at the time of external pip. And as I made mention, you can see when they're small end up, they're going to have, because there's no air cell, they're going to have to break that shell sooner than they might normally do. And you can see that it's just going to be a little bit prolonged hatching time. This here curve right here shows when the small end is down. They start later and they finish about the same time. This is looking at hatch time. And you can see exactly similar results here. This is small end up for the hatch time, and then this is right here, solid line is the small end down. So basically what I would say is, and I always look for it, is I want to see uniformity of angle within a setter. I want to be able to know if I'm, say, for instance, I'm walking into a chick master multi-stage. Is the right side turning the same angle as the left side? Is it the same from the front door to the back? Because if they're not, then airflow is going to be different, and we're going to have embryos developing at different temperatures. Then the other big thing is we need to have uniformity between setters. Okay? If we don't have uniformity between setters, then we're going to see differences in hatch time that we really don't want to see. And when this happens, or if we can have uniformity, I should say, we're going to be able to produce embryos that are much more uniform in development, which is what we really need. Because if we don't have uniformity, I believe firmly that we're going to be producing embryos that are at different stages. And I believe that that can impact the efficacy of your novel vaccination. There's a period of time in which you can hit that amnion or hit sub-Q or IM, And if you got embryos of different stages of development because of turning angle differences, it could impact the efficacy of the novel vaccination. And it becomes critically more important now that we're using vectored or recombinant vaccines. And then also, if we have different, if we have less uniformity, we're going to see differences in our hatch window, which is not what we want to see if we want to prevent dehydration in the chicks. So many different factors, as far as I'm concerned, can influence incubation. Turning is, I think, is an important one. Not only the angle of turning, but the frequency of turning can play a part, and the orientation of the egg can play a part. They're all going to influence the viability of that embryo and hatchling. And as far as I'm concerned, you have to have control of the incubational processes to produce hatchlings that are going to perform close to their genetic potential. So with that, I'll ask Keith if there are any questions that we can answer.
Thank you very much. That was very good. Covered a lot of good material there on turning and the effects. And we've got a few good questions here, several good questions. Gonna summarize all this stuff and then make you make some very definitive statements here, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. So a couple of them in here said, one, we'll just kind of get to, you talk to the turning and the incubation when it's important stuff. So in practicality, when should somebody stop turning in the incubator, in your opinion? I know there's probably machine differences and stuff like that, but
I don't like to, if I have to level eggs and stop turning for a heat problem, I don't like to do it until at least after day 13, 14.
Okay, so the turning, and that's kind of what we look at, is the turning at different times. For the embryo, it's necessary up through like 13 or 14, like you said. After that, we may or may not do it, depending on trying to get uniform air movement and ventilation and air exchange and stuff, because it kind of changes the machine. So you kind of gave some good information on, the different degrees of turning. So really get down to a hatchery, say that might only be, the eggs might be turning at 40 degrees, and that's all they do. What your thoughts on that? What would be the impact if they're just not getting that full 45?
Not getting the full 45 doesn't bother me.
So what if it's at 40?
The minimum I like to have is around 40 degrees.
Okay.
From vertical, and then try to achieve that in all machines.
So and you mentioned in your presentation there, if like with larger eggs, if it was dropped down, they were only getting like a 40-degree turn. If it was more frequent, that's better. If you're not getting 45, but you're getting 40, would you recommend then going to like every half-hour turn at 40 degrees, or?
Yeah.
I know you talked about the potential wear and tear on a machine, so yeah, there's all that stuff.
I think 40 will do very similar results as a 45 will. Okay. The one machine that I used to see a lot, you don't see it anymore. I think the last time I saw it was about 6 years ago. Was an old wooden Buckeye machine, and you get large eggs in that, and you were crushing a lot of eggs, so you had to alter the turning angle.
Okay. So then you had some information on turning it at 15 or 3 times, 15 degrees 3 times an hour and stuff. Would you still say we probably need to stay at turning once an hour, or what if somebody wanted to go to every 2 hours?
There hasn't been a lot of work done with decreasing the frequency of turning. But I always think back to, this is getting out into the extension stuff. You get these grade school kids doing their little incubation hatching in their schools. Mm. And they would just turn them maybe twice or 3 times a day, and they get 100% hatch of fertile. I don't think we need to do it 24, no. I think we could get by with less. How much less, I don't know.
Yeah. And I think from the embryo standpoint, I'm sure they could get by with less, but you know, from what I look at it, it's like every time it turns, you're changing air movement.
That's right, and it
that may the
changes the
benefit,
temperature.
right.
You're,
And that may be the benefit there is not so
yeah,
much that it's turning more, it's that each time you're changing some air movement and air exchange and temperature exchange.
yep,
So
that's right.
I would be leery of going to every 2 hours for that reason, as we want to get uniform. But like you said, as far as the embryo, doesn't really need turn that often, the embryo itself. What about, you talked about in there turning more frequent, like every 30 minutes for the first 72 hours. What would that be an option for hatcheries? Say they wanted to set eggs in the first 3 days, they
I
want
didn't
to
say
every
that.
30 minutes. Was that?
I didn't say that.
Well, no, you talked about like if you're at a less turn angle but turn more frequently,
Oh,
you know,
okay.
their effect. So the question is that, so what if somebody wanted to say, okay, we're still doing a 45-degree turn, but would we have a benefit of turning them maybe every 30 minutes the first 3 days and then going on after that?
Can I tell you that in a few weeks?
Oh, you're doing some good research on that or work?
No, I'm not, but I got a friend that is.
Oh, okay. Okay. So maybe then, right?
Yeah,
Maybe that might be a benefit, but we don't really know yet.
yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. Okay, a lot of duplicate questions here. Okay, somebody had a specific question that I guess happened in their facility. They said they had their turning failure at 10th day of incubation. The turning was out for 10 to 12 hours, but then it came back on. Would you likely see an issue with that? Or?
No, I wouldn't. I think if you're going to have a turning issue, you're early on, it might be more critical, but later, after you get past 7 days, I think how long they're out doesn't really matter. I think, personally, I think if you can get it corrected within 12 hours, you're going to do fine.
Okay. And you kind of mentioned that first 7 days was really
Yeah.
critical for the turning. So do you see a difference in, you did a lot of research on just turning itself, but in your experience out in the field and working with different hatcheries, do you see a difference in necessity of turning angle frequency or anything in relation to multi-stage or single stage equipment?
Angle frequency?
Well, the turning duration, I mean, the frequency or duration, do you see any different needs for single stage or multi-stage?
I think, well, with multi-stage, it's more difficult to alter some of that just because of the controls that you have for them. Single stage, you have the ability to alter the turning angle, at least on some machines, and the frequency of turning and the positioning. I mean, you can level them now for a certain period of time. And what some of that will do is in some machines would be to disrupt some of that, shall we say, stagnant air and produce, again, a more uniform environment within the incubator. And that's what we're trying to do, get it as uniform as possible within the incubator. So all the embryos are developing at the same stage.
Yeah. What do you use when you go out into your hatchery audits as far as measuring the angle in the setter? Do you have anything particular? I mean, I know you can get a thing on an iPhone, on a phone, but there's other equipment. What do you particularly use?
I do woodworking too, okay? And I've got this little gauge that I use for my saw blade for angle. And I take that with me. You can pick them up in a woodworking shop. I don't know, 15, 20 bucks, I think it was. It's digital. It's magnetic, so it attaches to the trolley just fine.
Yeah, that's what I have as a little digital one. For a while I was using the phone thing, and that's not as flat of a surface, but
right.
Basically anything that gives you a really accurate measurement, that you can get a solid surface from the bottom of your measurement to the rack.
And the other thing is within a machine, you're not going to get them all to be, let's say, exactly 40. But if you can get them within a couple degrees of one another, that should be more than adequate. At least that's what I've seen it to be.
Yeah. Because you're saying like between 40 and 45 is pretty good. We're not going to see a big difference there. Okay, if you're doing a breakout analysis, and what what would stand out to you in a breakout analysis that might say we may have some turning things? I mean, just, you threw a lot of stuff out there, but if you're in a breakout analysis, what say we might have a turning issue based on what?
Okay. What I'd be looking for is how complete was the chorial membrane formed, okay? Because I know that failure to turn at least sometime during that first 12 days, you're going to have some problems with complete formation. I'd be looking at such things as how much residual albumin is in the egg, which I should also point out, I'm not only looking at the inside of the shells when I pull the dead embryo out, I'm looking at the inside of the shells from the chicks that have already hatched too. I want to be looking at those for some of the things. I'd be looking at, I'd be looking for such things as, am I seeing some hemorrhaging, increase in hemorrhaging, and things like that also. Pretty much a lot of the heat stuff outside of the completeness of the cam.
So if you see some things that are related to high heat, you might also look at turning.
Oh, yes.
You're going to get hot spots in the machine to change and remove and stuff. What's your opinion on turning eggs during storage?
I'm good for it. I like it. If you're going to go into long-term storage, I see benefits from it. You have to have, of course, the capabilities in your egg room to hook your machines up to do it.
Mm-hmm. So it's just having the facilities to do it. But,
yeah.
Particularly long storage. So short-term storage, would it be worth the effort to try and do that?
No, I don't think so. If I'm holding eggs for more than 7 days, yes. And in this one company I do some work for, they have to because of the way they have to make their sets, and I see some good differences.
So you've seen it then, okay. I've got a lot of questions that are kind of the same. So kind of summarizing again, because we hear this a lot, and somebody had asked that we hear a lot of things, from a breakout standpoint of failure to turn. What again is the malposition, malformation that really sticks out as a turn?
Okay, it would be small end embryos with the head orientated to the small end of the egg, but that can also be a heat problem. Okay.
Or upside down set eggs too.
Or upside down eggs, correct. But at least now we know when our eggs are upside down if we ennoble.
Right.
Years ago when we didn't have it, it was a guess.
Yep.
And you couldn't really make good decisions then. Over left wing is another one that I'll see, and over right wing there'll be some increases.
Okay. What about, have you seen any benefits with turning angle or frequency in due to flock age, young flocks, old flocks, because the embryos are getting a little bit different? Have you seen any difference in that, or have you looked at that at all?
I haven't looked at it, and I have not really paid much attention to it. I couldn't answer that.
Okay. I think that would be hard to manage anyway, because most machines have a mix of young and old. So it would be hard to manage, even if we knew something was, there was benefit one way or another, I think. Let's see. Yeah, a lot of very similar questions here. We don't need to go over again, I don't think. So your acceptable ranges, just kind of summarize some of this, between 40 and 45 degree turn should be okay.
Yeah. Uniformity within machine and between machines.
Okay. Okay, the question is said they have a Jamesway multi-stage, setter turn of problem identified at hatch. And so okay, I know what they're asking. So you've got eggs that have come out, and you identified by that breakout a turn problem. Is there any corrective thing for the rest of the eggs in there? Or, I mean, you can't really turn more on the older ones that were skipped. You just fix it and hope, I would think. But do you know of any corrective type things? Or
But the only thing you might try and do is to increase frequency if the controls allow it.
Just true for the a little bit to kind of help with that, but can you do?
The problem should have been caught before they got down to hatch. With people walking in the machines every once in a while.
Here's a question by a friend of yours. I won't say his name, but I don't know. 30. If you have 35-degree turning one side, 45-degree to the other, I mean, is that going to make a difference? If one direction is going only 35 and the other 45?
Yeah, it changes airflow, and it's going to change the temperature of the embryo developing that.
So that's a big thing, is just their airflow and the potential, exchange of heat and air in there. Okay. Question you covered early on. Somebody says, does the embryo, will the embryo stick to the shell if not turned more frequently, or is you really just seeing the embryo malformations? I mean, like I said, once we believe that the embryo is going to stick to the shell.
Right. It may in some occasions, but I think more importantly is some of these other things I talked about in terms of producing quality chicks. Yeah, and it's not going to be likely you're going to see one little thing from that and have nothing else go wrong. Right. Somebody asked, you talked about that, and I think it was pretty much answered, but pushing the turning angle up to 90 degrees in that one study, they had to wire the eggs in and, all that stuff. But even pushing it out to 75 degrees, even wired in, was not only not beneficial, it was harmful, correct? Well, what you put in there. Yeah, I mean, that was done 60 years ago. Yeah. That trial. And then our machines nowadays, you couldn't get them to turn that far because you'd be crushing eggs. Right. So. Yep. Something on non-chicken eggs. What's the ideal turning for quail hatching eggs? And I don't know whether you work with quail much. Would quail, or say even turkey, would it follow the same patterns that you have? I would think so. I know in turkeys I've seen it similar. Quail, the only quail experience I have is, when I was working at the university and we always incubated similar to our chickens with regards to turning angles and that. I can't give a real good answer for that. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I would think from an embryological standpoint, we see so many other things that are similar. It would depend on your equipment or anything, but, quail, chicken, turkey, duck, the embryo is still developing. It's amazing to look at a embryo in a hummingbird egg or an ostrich egg. They do the same thing in there, just at different time intervals. That's so right. I would suspect it would be pretty much the same. Okay, so in relation to our transfer time, other than air movement or anything, do you think there's any benefit in stopping turning of the eggs at a certain time before transfer? Like we know sometimes we do it for airflow and different things like that, but for the embryo itself, would there be any benefit in stopping turning? Other than temperature, I don't believe so. Okay, so for the embryo itself, not. Okay. Okay, we've got a few other questions on here. Most of them you've covered already, and there's some that I may answer directly. Kind of works more specifically to Jamesway equipment, but a lot of good questions on there. If we didn't get to your question, I'll say go back and rewatch this, because a lot of the questions on here I think you covered very well. So I'm not going to have you regurgitate some of it again, but you covered most everything in there. So if we didn't get your question, go back and look at that. But I want to thank you for your time. This was a topic that we gave a couple of workshops several months ago and spent a lot of time answering questions on turning. So I knew it was a topic that people were concerned with, I think, because potentially they have turning problems and failures and want to know what it does, and not necessarily looking for something new, but wanting to know how it affects them. And so I think this is important and good. So if you got questions, more questions on this, you can get with Dr. Wineland.
or myself or Jamesway at webinars@jamesway.com. You can send email your questions to. But again, thank you for your time, Dr. Wineland. And,
Enjoyed it.
And glad to have you on board here. And for the rest of you, thank you for tuning in to our webinar today. And we hope to see you in 2 weeks. We'll have another webinar Wednesday at the same time in 2 weeks.